Hello and welcome to this presentation on the MITRE ATT&CK framework and its use in LogPoint. My name is Nils Krumrey and I'm the pre-sales lead for LogPoint in the UK. For those of you that don't know the MITRE framework, I'm hoping to give you an overview of what it is and what it means. And hopefully, if you're interested or have heard of MITRE before, at the end, you'll get a bit of an insight into how you might be able to use MITRE in LogPoint with the hands-on demonstration. So what is the MITRE ATT&CK framework? It's essentially an industry standard classification for cyber attacks and the different methods that get used during this attack. The benefit of it is that it is kind of vendor agnostic and community sourced, and it also contains very specific examples of those types of attacks. And by classifying them in a similar way across multiple products and multiple users, it becomes much easier to follow these and prevent them and get value from your detections. How does this compare to the cyber kill chain, which is also something that you've probably seen before and even maybe seen in LogPoint? And the difference between MITRE ATT&CK and the cyber kill chain largely revolves around the timing of these steps. The cyber kill chain, which is a bit older, kind of envisioned an attack as having very distinct steps in the process that follow one another. MITRE is more of a tool set that adversaries might be using. So they might be picking specific techniques from their tool set within that overall attack in different order. And you can see that here with the pre-attack stages and the attack stages, which is pretty much the equivalent of this sequence of events, where the pre-attack largely focuses on the reconnaissance and investigation, and then the attack is using that information that was gained. So if we look at the name attack, there is a slightly tenuous link there to the words that you see, which is adversarial, tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. But it gives an idea of the different parts that make up MITRE. So firstly, there is an adversary, which is the opposing party that is probably trying to gain access to your environment, to exfiltrate information, and maybe to deploy payloads to initiate ransomware, keyloggers, all those kind of things. They are probably running a wider campaign that you might be falling victim to. That often is around industries, around certain areas that are currently vulnerable. And they're trying the same techniques against all of these. So if you're lucky and you can spoil their party, then they might be moving on to someone else. And then lastly, in that process, they might be triggering certain indicators that we can spot in log messages and that we can map against the MITRE framework so that we can maybe understand which tactic they're currently deploying out of their tool set. There is an interesting pyramid of pain that tries to describe the different artifacts that might be deployed in this process and that attackers might be looking to use, and equally that you are able to spot. So at the bottom, there is the kind of almost noisy events that there is a lot of, but they're also very specific. So hash values are of little value to an attacker, and consequently sometimes aren't of much value to the defender either. But there's a lot of them, and if you identify them, they're relatively unique, but they're also very easy to change. And it's the same with IP addresses and domain names. If we're thinking about command and control servers and so on, that's kind of the level of defenses that often get deployed, and they're easy to circumvent. The top part of that pyramid is where it gets painful for an attacker if they have to change their game. So as I said, if they are deploying a campaign, they might be using the same tools all over. So if you're able to prevent them from using those tools, then they might have to seriously change their tactics and consequently often move on to the next target. So what's the attack framework use cases? So firstly, obviously detecting those types of events as they occur, maybe across tactics. So not just spotting the individual techniques, which might be detected across multiple products, antivirus, and so on, but also starting to create a bigger picture of, is this just a smokescreen for something else that's going on, for example, and then following these indicators around in a managed fashion. Then that information leads to threat intelligence, which can be incorporated. We've talked about those indicators that might be easier or less easy to change. So if we know what those patterns look like and where they come from, then we can use that. Also, that leads us on to maybe proactively using the MITRE framework to trigger certain assessments, which is the red teaming and pen testing and so on that's going on. So it gives us almost a playbook of the attacks that might be used against you, and you might be able to run them yourself to see how they get identified and how you might be mitigating against that. So if we think about Norman, the normal OPSEC guys, his challenge in kind of the wider security environment is that there is a lot of indicators, a lot of different tools to manage in order to spot these. And essentially with the limited amount of time that we all have, what should he look for? And where does he start? And that's really where MITRE can come in. So if we look at the MITRE framework, we'll look at that later in the demo. There is a wide matrix of different tactics that the attackers might be deploying, and then concrete techniques underneath that give you more detailed information about that attack. And crucially for us as a SIEM vendor, it gives us real world examples of how these attacks unfolded, and often indicators that we can use to spot in your log files to identify when they get used. Once you have identified something like that, or you're preparing for it, obviously SIEM is only part of that answer. There will be other tools involved in order to either detect it in the first place or certainly to mitigate against that. And that's another area where the MITRE framework helps with additional information that's available that you can use to improve your defenses. So in summary, the advantage of the MITRE framework is that it gives us a common language across multiple security tools, across multiple strategies, to understand what to look for, where to start, and how all of these attacks and tactics and techniques that are deployed might be related to one another.
Let's take a look at what the MITRE framework actually looks like in action in your LogPoint environment. And what we're looking at here is essentially what we're aiming for. You might have seen it in other material before. It's the MITRE Attack Analytics dashboard that comes pre-built with LogPoint, and you can add that from your vendor dashboards with that orange plus and use it. But chances are that if you haven't configured anything else, by default, this will probably look pretty empty. So there are a few other things that you want to do before you can start using MITRE in LogPoint. And the best place to start is probably by taking a look at the actual framework itself on attack.mitre.org. And you can see those techniques and tactics that we've talked about. The idea would be that you familiarize yourself with the framework itself and take a look at the different tactics that there are and maybe decide on a technique or multiple techniques that you want to start monitoring in LogPoint, perhaps because there's something that's going on in your industry or something that's happened to you before. But because there's quite a lot of these, another good thing to do is to go onto the LogPoint homepage .com/MITRE, and you get a similar view. Hopefully it will look quite familiar, and it's the MITRE framework from the LogPoint perspective. The different colors here try to show you how much coverage we have for each of these techniques with pre-built alert rules in LogPoint. So there's some blank ones for which we don't have rules. Often they don't lend themselves to a SIEM alert. So that's a man-in-the-middle attack. There's no point in trying to find these in LogPoint. We don't have them. But the darker ones we have rules for. So if you've decided to take a closer look at defense evasion, and maybe the process injection is the one that you really want to start to use, you can click on that to get a description, which is straight from the MITRE homepage. And crucially, that gives you the MITRE ATT&CK ID here as well, T1055. With those orange bits, you can expand a bit further, and you can see that there's sub-techniques aligned to it, including one here that's highlighted with coverage in LogPoint. So that is the same information that you would find here under process injection if you want to read up more on that, including those sub-techniques. And you can also see that there are some examples of where that technique has been used, and some more information that you can click on, including some of the processes that this is actually trying to monitor. And we'll see them reflected in LogPoint. So back in LogPoint, it all starts with alert rules. So if we take a look at the alert rules that are defined, you can see that my user account already has quite a lot of these. Some of these might already have MITRE enabled as well, but we're trying to add a new rule that comes pre-built and is a vendor rule. So there's different ways of trying to find the ones that are predefined. So in this case, this was the process injection. So maybe you do want to just search for process. You'll probably find it like that. There might still be quite a lot of them. But thankfully, we know the MITRE ATT&CK ID, which for this one is in the description, so we can find these relatively easily. And actually, there are two. One's kind of the parent technique, the T1055, and then there is a sub-technique, T1055.012. So we can add both of them and activate them in LogPoint. I'm just making them my own by cloning them, and then I can see them under my rules here. It's always worth checking what these rules are actually trying to look for. So by looking at this one, you can see that in the query, it is starting by looking for Windows Sysmon alerts. So that is what I was referring to earlier. For this to work, you obviously then need to have Windows Sysmon logs coming into your LogPoint. And that's a discussion for another time and how you make that happen. But you can also see how you can see some of those image names that we saw on the MITRE homepage reflected in this alert. They are relatively unusual to be used in this way, and that's what we're looking for in this particular alert. If this happens, traditionally, and it's true for any alert in LogPoint, they will end up as an incident in your timeline view here. This is still useful for this kind of temporal history, but there's no room for the MITRE framework in here. So now the question is, how does that make its way into LogPoint? So that is actually on the alert rules, if we take a look, predefined under the notification. And that's how alert rules get logged within LogPoint itself. And we can create additional analytics on the triggering of those rules. So you can see that is a rule that I've just added, but it already has syslog enabled by default because it is aligned to MITRE. And we've actually hidden the payload for MITRE hard-coded in that message that goes back into LogPoint in the notification. So you can see the attack ID, the framework, and so on. And that's actually also how you could align your own alerts with MITRE. So you just need to make sure that you notify back into LogPoint and you pass the right attack IDs and so on back into LogPoint. What happens with this then? It goes to a device, 127.0.0.1, which is localhost, and that's predefined in your LogPoint. It actually does a few other things in terms of performance logs and audit logs and so on. So that device already exists by default, and it already has a syslog collector enabled by default, and there is a default processing policy. So all of this should be happening automatically. That processing policy then makes sure to normalize those alert logs and others and put them in a repository. There is actually another processing policy called LogPoint Alerts. You can switch your local host to that, and it then strips out the LogPoint alerts and puts them in a LogPoint alert repository separately. That's not happening by default. You kind of have to switch that around, and it kind of strips them out. So you might have seen that before in LogPoint and wondered what that repository was for. So now you know. After those alerts get triggered, they will make their way into LogPoint, and we can start searching for them in the repositories. So the norm ID that these come in as are LogPoint alert. So if I search for that, you'll see that there's a lot of incident logs that arrive, and we label them with incident as well. So that's something that you could search for. Because there's quite a few alerts that are already active in here, they don't all have MITRE enabled. But you can see that there's some that come back that there's 3 different attack ID values that we get for some of these. So that's one way in which you can then find them by looking for attack ID equals star. That gives you the list of those that have happened. And ordinarily, if you were now to visualize, you get the usual LogPoint options. But if we chart count by attack ID, you'll get a breakdown like this. And as soon as that is in the results, you'll get an additional option, which is the attack framework visualization, which then gives you this type of view. And now, because of what I searched for in the time frame, there's not that much going on. There's only one that's highlighted happening very often. But if you extrapolate that to all the other alerts that might be active that are in different techniques and tactics, ultimately you would be getting a view like this from the alerts that get triggered. So you can see here, this is the one that was happening very often. Therefore, it is quite dark. There's also some here. And overall, in this tactic, there is quite a lot of activity you might want to look at. And because all of this is in a LogPoint repository, we can do other visualizations like you see here, but breaking it down by the different techniques and tactics, doing what are the top 10 and the hosts involved and so on. So there's a lot you can do with the logs once they are in LogPoint. So hopefully that was useful and tied a few things together for you and sets you off on the journey of using MITRE in LogPoint.